Well, thank you, Gentleman Command. First, I want to say that I appreciate seeing the size of the crowd that's here in this room. That tells me how much this has impacted a lot of lives, and you're looking for answers and you want to know the facts, and I appreciate that. I've tried to also dig into the facts, and I haven't seen any reticence on the part of the Corps. When we ask a question, we got the answer, unless they needed a few days because they've been under the gun all summer long. For me, I also want to say this publicly into the record. There are votes going on in Congress tonight. They aren't of great significance. I decided it would be better to be here than it was to be there. So that's my public announcement in case anybody wants to be critical of that decision. And I have lived under these floods. I could tell you a lot of stories, but that's enough. Anybody that has been underwater for a period of time and has seen how hard it is. It's easier to go through a fire or a tornado than it is a flood, because the fire will be put out in a matter of hours or days, and the tornado will be over when the wind stops blowing, and you can start cleaning up right away as soon as the weather is out of the way, and the insurance company will be there, and in a matter of hours or days or weeks at the most, you know how big the check's going to be, and you can start to make your plans on what you're going to do to put your life back together. Floods are different. Floods are different when you get a normal flood, where there's a fast runoff, where the water comes up fast, goes down fast. You still have a long time getting definitive answers for a lot of reasons. And when you have a flood where the water comes up slow and goes down slow, a flood of this magnitude that runs for months throughout the summer, then you start to look at the damage when the water goes down. Then you can assess how many feet of sand are on your bottom, or what your home is like, your buildings are like, and your businesses are like. These are some of the toughest, most gut-wrenching decisions, and it's hard for everybody. And I'm not here with clear, definitive answers on what might be there from a relief perspective. You've seen some of those pieces come together. I wanted to address a single subject here, and that is how we prevent this from happening again under a similar or a flood of greater magnitude. And I'm talking about the runoff and that comes down through the 6 reservoirs in the Pick-Sloan program, and essentially that is controlled by the discharge rate at Gavin's Point Dam. And as I look at that, at first the Pick-Sloan program was built for flood control. And yes, we had floods that went on through the previous century, and during the World War II years, we had at least one large flood that accelerated this. We had the 1952 flood that accelerated this, and by 1968, the Pick-Sloan program was built. We all know in this room it was built to protect us from serious downstream flooding. We also know in this room, I believe, that the 16.3 million acre feet that General McMahon spoke to was tied back to the largest runoff experience. Now that was the 1881 flood. If you're going to build a system like Pick-Sloan with these huge reservoirs that I think are well designed, and it's a magnificent human achievement, you pick a benchmark, you adjust to that benchmark, and you do your calculations from there. That is what happened. But now we've experienced the 2011 runoff, and then I'm talking about the water above Gavin's Point in a magnitude that we had not experienced before. To give you a measure, 1881 was estimated at 42 million acre feet, and in 97 there was a 48 million acre feet. That's the largest modern runoff. That's the largest runoff since Pick-Sloan was built. They discharged 70,000 cubic feet per second in 97, and you hardly heard about the flood. I remember about 2 years ago, May 8th, on a Sunday, if that's the right date, I drove across the bridge to come to the airport, and the river was bank full here at Omaha. We didn't hear about that because the levees held them in. That came from the tributaries down below Gavin's Point. And so I just ask you to keep in mind, there's the management of all of that runoff up above Gavin's Point, and then there's also the risk of the runoff below Gavin's Point, and we can't control the tributaries below Gavin's Point. And so I wanted to incorporate that into this discussion, because what we're really talking about here with the bill that I'm about to propose is the runoff from Gavin's Point upstream, and that has to also be calculated with what our known runoff from Gavin's Point downstream. But that's the acre feet. Another one is that I do disagree on the designation of a 500-year flood event. We don't have records that go back far enough for us to have an empirical judgment on what a 500-year flood event is. I just know that I've lived through some of them. Lord knows why I've lived through so many 500-year events. But He's the only one that knows. And so what I do know is that we can make adjustments to known events. 2011 is a known event. Now, in defense of the Corps, I want to give you this judgment, though, on some of the data that I've looked at. for a period of time in late May and early June, just the flow rate in the Yellowstone River was 150,000 cubic feet per second. That's almost the maximum discharge that we experienced coming out of Gavin's Point. So if you think about the magnitude of this, if all of the tributaries had been empty from Gavin's Point upstream, and only the Yellowstone was running water, and we had no dams, we would have seen water levels very similar to those that we experienced. Not for as long a time, but remember those other tributaries were running too. I think we would have seen significantly higher water levels than we saw this summer. Yes, for a shorter period of time because it would have gone down in a faster rate with a higher flow. But these dams did mitigate damage that we would have suffered otherwise. And so it isn't that we've had this all dumped on us and it's all turned into damage. There's protection that I don't think I've heard anybody talk about that has to do with the storage that kept the water level from going above the part we experienced. That's just an objective viewpoint on the other side of this argument. My argument is not only to set the storage levels that are at 16.3 million acre feet now, to set it with a greater volume of storage to protect us from the greatest runoff we've experienced, 2011, and write it into law, that if we have a runoff that's experienced that's greater than 2011, automatically it's adjusted so that we protect ourselves from the greatest runoff experienced. And keep in mind that there have been 5 different versions of the master manual, and that's since around 1968, probably prior to that actually. The last version took 14 years to write with public hearings, all the litigation that took place. And I don't know of any environmentalist litigation that has been initiated by the Corps of Engineers, but they are controlled by court decisions. And so the long saga of rewriting the master manual has to deal with judge-made law. And I will tell you, if Congress passes a law, that eliminates a lot of judge-made law. If we say these are the parameters, and that's the voice of the American people in this republic, by the way, then those values can be set with far less interference from environmentalist lawsuit and other interest lawsuits because Congress will have set that benchmark. That's another good thing about legislation. Then I would say that, a couple of more points and moving towards conclusion here, and that is, a year ago, we didn't know this was going to happen. No one could have predicted it. If anyone in the Corps of Engineers or anyone who had influence there had been clairvoyant, and with a deep conviction that we were going to see this kind of snowfall, this kind of runoff, they would not have been able to manage the river a lot different than they did because they're controlled by the master manual. And we've experienced 8 years of record drought, and the politics that go on upstream, it would have been impossible to initiate the kind of discharge that was necessary, even if someone had been able to play call shot. So I put that statement out into the record too, so that we are dealing with those droughts upstream for all these years, and that colors the judgment. And then, but though coming into 2011, say October of 2010, the odds of this kind of flood were exactly equal to the odds of this kind of flood coming in 2012 or 2013. It's like the question of, if you toss a coin and it's tails twice in a row, what's the odds it'll come up tails the third time? 50-50. We don't know. And I don't know that this is a 500-year event. Like I say, I've lived through a number of them. And so what we did is we've had some discussions with Jody and others with the Corps of Engineers the impact of the bill that I've introduced, which is H.R. 2942. And there are some copies and handouts around here. My staff will be around to help get some to you that are interested in it. But we took a look, and with the conversations that we've had, first was that it would have to lower the water levels 12 feet in the upper 3 reservoirs. And that was at 70,000 cubic feet per second discharge. Recalculated at 100,000, and remember we saw 160,000 coming down the river. Recalculated at 100,000, then that became 6 feet of lowering of the target elevation in the 3 upper reservoirs, according to the language that's in my bill 2942. When we put that on the chart to ask what is the historical experience, we found out that historically these reservoirs have been lower than they were targeted primarily because of the droughts. But the experience since 1968 says this, that Fort Peck was down an average of 7.4 feet below the target elevation. It's similar for the following 2 dams, and I do have the charts here in my hand. I won't bore you with all those numbers. But we put together a bar graph that shows the target elevations. Fort Peck was 2234, that's above sea level. And the average actual elevation at the beginning of the runoff season for the duration of Pick Sloan was 26.4. But my bill, according to the 6 foot lower in elevations projected, would have resulted in a 28.0. That's just an example. It's not as dramatic as some people upstream would say it is. The average that they've experienced is lower than the targeted elevations that we've discussed. And so I think that some of it, the criticism from upstream is a red herring. The fishing interest, the recreational interest will go a long ways to protect their interests. I will say to them, there will be a lot of acres of water up there to fish in, but if nobody down here has any money, they won't be able to go up and do that. Whatever it takes to replace, there won't be any recreational reduction that's measurable, but the value that it's going to take to put this all back together down here is counted in hundreds of millions. In fact, I believe it's counted in billions. So I want to protect us from those billions in the future years, and that's why I'm pushing this piece of legislation. And I appreciate the cooperation that we've had, and I'll appreciate your respectful input to the people that know these numbers and are here to hear from you. And I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words here at the beginning of this meeting, and I'll continue to work with the Corps and all of the public up and down the river to try to get the best result that we can. Thank you very much.